Before we begin, I'd like to just do a quick introduction of Dr. Abdullah. Dr. Abdullah bin Hamid Ali is an assistant professor of Islamic law and prophetic tradition at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. His course teachings include prophetic tradition, commercial law, family law, inheritance law, jurisprudential principles, and Islamic virtue ethics. He holds a PhD in cultural and historical studies in religion and an MA in ethical and social theory from the Graduate Theological Union. He obtained his BA in Islamic law from the prestigious Al-Qarain University of Fez, Morocco in 2001. He served as full-time Islamic chaplain at the State Correctional Institute of Chester, Pennsylvania from 2002 until 2007, and is the founding director of the Lamppost Education Initiative. His research interests include the interconnection between law and identity formation, comparative Islamic law, and Islam's role in the modern world. Inshallah, today will be part one of his topic, Saving the Muslim Family, the Threat of Postmodernism, with the following two parts coming up on Monday and Tuesday. So, Dr. Abdullah, whenever you're ready, inshallah, you can begin.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Are you able to hear me?
Wa alaikum assalam. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, right. I just wanted to. I was speaking before. No, I can. Okay. Barakallahu feek. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala khatim al-anbiya wa sayyid al-mursalin. نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم زدنا ولا تنقصنا وأكرمنا ولا تهنا وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وارض عنا وارضنا يا رب العالمين. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's a great honor to be taking part in this intensive this program, which is an extremely important program for the Muslim community. And I also feel very honored to be invited by DarusSalam Masjid for this program, and also to share this particular, I guess you say, this page with many individuals who are my friends, which include, of course, Sheikh Abdurrahman bin Yusuf and Sheikh Tamim, Ahmadi, Dr. Shadi Masri, Dr. Sharif Tubri, Dr. Mateen Khan, among others, and all the others who I forgot to mention, but whose names I don't recall at the moment, but hopefully they won't take any offense to that. And I've been given an extraordinary task, in which is to try to cover in about 5 hours a number of issues which are extremely important for our future. The Muslim family is under threat, brothers and sisters, and we also need to understand that this is not only a problem for the Muslim community, but all communities which champion traditional families, that the human family, we can say, is actually it's under threat because of certain ideologies, certain philosophical traditions which are prominent in the world today, and have gained quite a significant amount of influence politically, and who not only want us to simply want us to embrace what they believe through persuasion, but through compulsion. And I think that a good place to begin with this is just simply going back to the description of this particular short course, if you'd like to call it that. And we have been taught that the stability of any society rests upon stable families and a well-informed populace. Families are the foundation of every society. An informed and moral population pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful. What happens, however, when what is true, good, and beautiful are distorted and new definitions are imposed on society. What happens when family and personhood are redefined? So this short course aims to acquaint students with the moral dangers that the media, feminism, queer theology, and other aspects of postmodern philosophy pose to Muslim families. And we can say also to families in general, or traditional families in general. I think it's also a good point, a good way to start this particular um, this lesson, which I think is a good way to frame pretty much everything that we're going to be speaking about today, tomorrow, and Tuesday, is with this particular hadith, which is reported by Imam Muslim, at least this particular narration is reported by Imam Muslim, where it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Verily, Iblis places his throne over the water. He then deploys his troops. إن إبليس يضع عرشه على الماء ثم يبعث سراياه." The closest to him in rank are those greatest in seduction. Excuse me. One of them comes saying, "I have accomplished this and this." He responds, "You have done nothing." Then one of them comes saying, "I did not abandon him until I separated him from his wife." He then brings him close to him, saying, "Such a blessing are you." In other words, Iblis is proud of this individual who was able to separate a man from his wife, or we can say who was proud to split up a family. And this itself is one of Iblis's greatest achievements, the most celebrated achievements, when he's able to separate a family or divide people, divide humanity. And humanity, as we know, itself is a family, but of course, the macro family itself. And so Iblis threatened in the Quran that he would stand upon the straight path and he would come to us from our rights and from our lefts and from above us, from below us, front of us, and behind us. And he would say, وَلَا تَجِدُ أَكْثَرَهُمْ شَاكِرِينَ, saying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you would not find most of them to be grateful. And which is to say that one of the sources of the greatest, I guess you'd say, sense of disconnection, right, in our society and our world today is this widespread sense of ingratitude, I would say. And we know ingratitude in the Arabic language is simply another word for kufr. Kufr itself, which you know, is the opposite of iman, but also kufr is the opposite of shukr. And so that it's connected, they're connected. Ingratitude is connected with disbelief. And we live in a world where people are just so ungrateful for what they have. And that in itself drives quite a much of the discontent, quite much of the division, much of the we call the power struggles, which fundamentally people have deemed to be the most important of all pursuits in this particular life at this particular moment in human history. But we're not grateful for the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken us from darkness into light through Iman, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us relative safety, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through technological advances, He has allowed for us to communicate, even, for instance, the way that we are able to communicate right now, through telephones, computers, through all the other advances in medicines, et cetera, which have made life overall easier for humanity, generally speaking. Right, so we're very ungrateful. And before proceeding, I just wanted to announce that in about 45 minutes, we're going to just take about 10-minute break for Salatul Maghrib, because it'll be coming in for me. And once we return, we'll continue with some discussion of the first of the three particular points I want to cover over the next few days related to feminism. But I did want to start with this introduction. So Shaitan celebrates when a human family is divided. He celebrates when a man is separated from his wife. And we just need to keep this in mind as we continue in our lives and our pursuits. So there are three basic topics I want to cover in these 5 hours. One, I want to deal with how the media molds reality, how feminism and the changing about feminism and the changing American family, and we would say the dangers of queer theory. Now, a lot of these topics will be interspersed with one another. but I'll try my best to focus on each particular module as we come to them. However, you will probably see a bit much more sort of overlap in the topics because they share common philosophical roots to an extent. And so I would say if we want to talk about objectives of the course, one of the objectives is that we want to learn the role the media, Hollywood, and public education play in shaping reality and morality. To learn about the main corporations responsible for most of the information we consume and their goals, because that's something that I often think that Muslims overlook, that we are a community, especially the Sunni community, which has wrestled throughout our history with trying to reconcile religion with rationality or religion with reason. We didn't really struggle with reconciling religion with science, but religion with reason. For this particular reason, Sunnis were very late, I would say, to embracing the importance of philosophy. If anything, we probably could say that Sunnis have probably embraced philosophy the most during the last century, right? And especially perhaps in the last decade or so, that there's people we talk openly about, and celebrate people like Ibn Rushd or Ibn Sina, Farabi, others like that, even though many of our scholars in the past had some very negative things to say about them, some even going as far as declaring them to be unbelievers. But philosophy is extremely important for us in order for us to overcome the challenges to the Muslim family. We also want to learn what the main postmodern philosophical strains, and I'll talk a little bit more about this idea, with concept of postmodernism. We had Mubin Vaid also, of course, I forgot to mention him as well, who is part of this program, who I would imagine he and both Dr. Sharif probably covered some things related to postmodernism, or perhaps even queer theory. And so if there's some overlap, or if I'm repeating some things, I apologize for that in advance. If there's some clash between what I said and what they said, then I would defer to them, just consider them to be default correct, rather than myself, So I think that this probably would be the better way to deal with this. But we want to learn about what the main postmodern philosophical strains are that currently threaten religious and societal order, to learn about the different waves, merits, and demerits of feminism, and to learn about the efforts to redefine the human being, the moral consequences of that, and the members' ideological diversity. Especially I'm talking about the LGBTQ, or what we call those who embrace what can be called queer theology. Even though as I mentioned, there's some diversity among the groups who themselves are affiliated or actually fall under one of those particular letters. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit too, before moving forward, about what we can call our theological anthropology. And what I mean by this is that every ethical system that exists on the planet begins with some conceptual, some theory of the human being, right? And so any philosophy that you study, especially moral philosophy, has in mind the human being and basically what the human being is supposed to look like and supposed to be like. Islam has its own theological anthropology. And so there's a connection between anthropology and ethics, in that we are considered to be children of heaven. And this is one point that we begin with, is that we are children of heaven, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, right, for heaven. And he did not create us for the earth, that our sojourn here is temporary, is only a means for redemption, right, to prepare a better home to return to. And the proof that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not mean for us to be here is the very fact that we died. But we originate from heaven, and we were meant for heaven, and that is our true home. And we were created for the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the service to his creation, which is an aspect of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are moral, rational creatures who are interdependent. We strive to help one another, or at least we're supposed to return home, right? And so, of course, home is Jannah. that is what we are supposed to be doing. Our individual and collective moral well-being are the source of our success and salvation. Our individual and collective moral well-being are the source of our success and salvation. This is important for us, brothers and sisters, to reflect upon. And we also believe that we have a nature and we seek to perfect it prior to transitioning from this world. In other words, we are born one way and we develop, but human perfection takes time. That we are expected to become something more than what we are when we are brought into this world. And this is what Islam helps us to do. This is what marriage also helps us to do, is what having children helps us to do. If we approach them with the right mindset and the right assumptions, rather than the assumptions and the philosophy, the moral philosophy of others, right? Because either you want to be influenced by what we can call Islamic epistemology or Islamic moral philosophy, or you are influenced by, or you are guided by your own personal made up moral philosophy, or you're guided by someone else's moral philosophy, right? And so we always have to check ourselves. And this is why we need to return to the Quran over and over and over. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ ولو كان من عند أفلا يتدبرون القرآن أم على قلوب أقفالها, that, do they not ponder and reflect upon the Quran, or do they have locks on their hearts? If it had been from other than God, then they would find much contradiction therein. The Quran itself is a guide. إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنُ يَهْدِي لِلَّتِي هِيَ أَقْوَمُ. This Quran guides to that which is most straight. This is what our book teaches us. It is hudal lil muttaqin. And so we have our own theological anthropology. So history and reality are two extremely important topics when it comes to almost anything realistically, and that history is important for many reasons, as we know. But instead of me trying to just speak on that, I'll just move to certain quotes that I wanted to highlight. So the first quote is by Edmund Burke, is an Irish statement from the 18th century. For those who are not familiar with him, that one of the most statements he's known for making is, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And what we see, which is really interesting, is that when it comes to these groups, which we say, which threatened the Muslim family or threaten the human family today, that many of them seem to be attempting to erase history. In American history, for instance, you see, want to get rid of all of the statues that are reminding us of the bad times in American history. Of course, whatever, people have different reasons for that naturally, or people, they want to ban the classic books, Mark Twain, et cetera, because he uses the N-word, those type of things. But it's important for us to know history. If you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And the same thing can apply on, recent history, not just, sort of ancient history, but even recent history with relationship to statism, with relationship to colonialism, empire building, et cetera, et cetera. If we overlook these things, then we will become gullible, right? And not as cynical, because I believe that there's a certain amount of cynicism that is healthy, right, for people, contemporary people, and that's just my view on the issue. But if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. It's like the Jews would say about the Holocaust, never again, right? And so you're constantly reminded every single year when films about the Holocaust are played on television, of what happened to the Jews, and others have tried to do the same thing. Another important quote is by the author who used to write, his pseudonym was George Orwell, the English novelist who lives during the first half of the 20th century, who said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." right? And so we see a lot of these type of efforts at play right now. And so again, that we're supposed to be talking about saving the Muslim family, but I believe personally that this is part and parcel of what is necessary in order for us to do so, because of Muslims, as I mentioned before, the very fact that so many Muslims have not paid enough attention to the importance of philosophy, that they have embraced other people's moral philosophy without even knowing it, right? And have abandoned their own philosophy because of the lack of knowledge of the Quran and of the Sunnah. And that itself, we can say, would be a part of not being aware of history. Not knowing the Quran is not only to be unaware of the moral teachings of Islam, but also that which is what constitutes our legacy, or our tradition, or we can say an aspect, and most important aspect of our history as Muslims, because we want to transmit our tradition onto our children, and we want an Islam for the future. We don't want a cultural Islam, an Islam where people only identify with Islam by their headscarves or by the beards, or et cetera, et cetera. We want Muslims who actually know their religion, who actually imbibe the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and they encourage virtuous characteristics, courage and generosity, et cetera, et cetera. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, I imagine that all of us are familiar with Sheikh Hamza. Zaytuna College, he of course has been highly influential in the area of da'wah and the spread of Islam in the English-speaking world. That he popularized a statement, which is, if you don't philosophize, somebody else will philosophize for you. It's as simple as that. Right. Now, I believe this statement originated from Sayyid Hussein Nasr, but I would say that perhaps Sheikh Hamza is the one who popularized it. And I think that this is one of the truest statements and one of the most important statements that one can make in our time, because, as I stated before, that if you have an uneasiness about philosophy, right, and you don't have a philosophy, right, in particular a moral philosophy where you understand where your morality originates, you know what the assumptions you're supposed to be working with, and perhaps even understanding the difference between something which is non-negotiable and what's negotiable, that it's easy for you to deal with the world and to know when someone is now infringing upon your territory and trying to convince you to embrace their moral thinking, in which I think too many Muslims themselves, unfortunately, don't do enough of. They don't do enough of, right? So if you don't philosophize, somebody else will philosophize for you. It's as simple as that. The human being is wired to judge. All judgment follows certain apprehension, right? In other words, we hear quite often today that you can't judge me, God's my judge, et cetera, or people shouldn't judge. But we have to push back against this idea that judgment is something bad. If anything, judgment is completely natural, and judgment itself cannot be extricated. It cannot be removed from innate human cognitive operations, right? That human beings judge. We place labels on things, on peoples. We give things names. We give them value judgments. We place things in a hierarchy of value, right? These are things that we all do. And family, of course, should be at the top of the hierarchy of values, and making strong, committed, believing families who are strong in their faith, educated in their religion. And this is one of the principles, I would say, that perhaps it challenges what is popular in the world, in the Western world right now, because of some of these, if not all of these ideologies that we're going to talk about. Now, we can talk about three basic civilizational paradigms. Now, of course, we are talking about this in context of Europe and the West, it's quote unquote, and that and the reason I say this is that what we don't want to make a mistake of doing is fundamentally universalizing European experience. Now, of course, Europeans have accomplished that to an extent, that they've made their experience universal, right? That making it seem as if history is theirs, right? And whatever happens with Europeans and those who left Europe and came to the Americas is what happened to the world, But since we are in the West, quote unquote, we need to be aware of certain changes, certain philosophical changes that have happened in our history and how we're still affected by these ideas. One period we can call the period of pre-modernism. We can roughly say prior to what was before the sort of Enlightenment period, roughly speaking, and then the period of modernism, and then thirdly, postmodernism. So I want to talk a little bit about both three of them, all three of them, just a little bit. Now, the pre-modern perspective was a perspective wherein the cosmos was judged to be, of course, both material and immaterial, or physical and metaphysical. In other words, the people who were dominant, those who were in political authority were largely religious people. And this for the pre-modern world, and we're talking about, of course, in Europe, the Christians, they ruled, of course, in Asia and in parts of Africa. Of course, the Muslims were in charge. And in this particular period, that we believe both in the material and the immaterial, that we believe that the cosmos was not only made up of material things, that we didn't believe only in material causation. We believed in immaterial causation, or we say metaphysical causation as well. So, for instance, among our beliefs as Muslims are, angels exist, they're real. The jinn are real. We believe that sihr is real. Magic, for instance, we say sorcery is real. We believe that in the evil eye, al-ayn al-haq, is real. That these things are causative objects, I guess you could say, or things which have an impact on the material realm as well, right? Dua and dhikr, the recitation of the Quran, the performance of salah, fasting, right? All of these things not only have a physical effect, on the human being, but they have a spiritual effect on the human being. And so we're living in a world where, of course, once modernity comes in, or we say the philosophical aspects of modernity, which we generally refer to as modernism, it was born. Then this aspect of the assumptions of human beings was largely or vehemently fought against. It was largely militated against by the political forces and the intellectual forces in the world, right? But of course, as Muslims, at least many of us continue to believe that the world is both material and immaterial, both physical and metaphysical, that causation is not only physical, it's not only material causation that we believe in. The pre-modern perspective also placed human beings within the realm of nature, that human beings are part of nature. Like so often, today we continue to operate on these assumptions when we talk about the difference between human beings and of course, natural phenomenon such as observable things like tornadoes and hurricanes and animals, in their original habitats. We think of them as being the natural environment of the earth. The human beings are not really part of nature. But in the pre-modern period, human beings were part of nature, right? We are part of nature. We're part of the natural order, right? And we have a telos. We have we're meant here for something. That there's God created us to become something more than what we are, right? We can say, at least in one particular tradition as well, pre-modern tradition, the human being was seen as the psychosomatic creature. In other words, that the human being, at least in the Aristotelian view, the human being was a both body and spirit. And the spirit does things to affect the body does things to affect the spirit. We're psychosomatic, we operate that way, and that's just our complete nature is both physical and spiritual, not spiritual only, or it's like according to the Platonic ideas, which is that, that you are simply a soul placed inside of a body, that you are, there's something in the machine, you are this, soul which is trapped inside of a body. And this is an important perspective to consider when we start talking about transgenderism, especially because the idea of transgenderism is that there is a soul, which is a feminine soul, which is trapped inside of a male body, and vice versa, right? But you do have these perspectives that did exist prior to the modern period, and so psychosomatic creature that we have, human beings have emotions, appetites, and thoughts, and all of these were considered to be part of the natural order as well. And the city is supposed to reflect the individual. In other words, the state is supposed to reflect the individual. So if the human being is in this life expected to pursue virtue, become a better person, then the state is just simply a macrocosm of the individual. In other words, that when we look, for instance, reflect upon a scholar like Aristotle, he wrote his ethics, but then he also wrote his politics after that. So his ethics itself, is just simply about the individual. Politics was about the well-being of the community, of the social order, right, of the polity itself, right, which was itself an example, thinking of sort of like the polity itself of the community being as a large body, an individual, which if ordered properly was supposed to work effectively. In other words, so in this particular perspective of this paradigm, the human being was always becoming something more, and they had to be involved in activities to make them something better than what they are, and then the state would reflect that as well. And once, of course, this breaks down, then the state, it becomes more corrupt, right? Once the individual breaks down, then society breaks down. And so we talked about, of course, the family, of course, being the most important part of society, the most important social unit of society itself. So moving from the pre-modern to the modern period, and so again, we're thinking about this in the context of perhaps we say the Enlightenment, that during the modern period, or in this perspective, reality now can only be known through the senses via experimentation and experience. So we can only believe in what we can prove, what we can detect and know objectively, what we can taste, we can hear, we can see, we can feel, right? We can smell, right? And so the modernism or modernity, we can say even, that it ushered in this new period, this perspective, this paradigm shift into that, okay, well, all this idea about metaphysical things, about superstitions, about spiritual spirits and sprites, all this stuff, it's all just superstitious, unverifiable information. The human beings during the modern period was placed outside of nature. The human being not part of nature. Why? The human being, you have emotions, you have appetites, you have thoughts. These are things which are not constants, right? So the human beings' emotions, etc., they can change, right? So you're now no longer part of nature. Liberty becomes the penultimate value. And it is to be secured by the state, that the state ensures that you have liberty, that what's most important is not about the question of overall benefit or harm. It's about liberty. How much freedom do you have? And then happiness and human flourishing or human flourishing becomes subjective. When prior to this, we can talk about it being much more objective. Human flourishing, of course, determined by the extent of one's virtue, how much you have mastery over yourself, over your emotions, over your appetites, over your thoughts, right? And then you become a truly happy person. And if anything, this is what is meant in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when it was related by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu. He said, that the creation of one of you is brought together in the belly of his mother for 40 days as a form of nutfa, and then alaqa, and then mudgha, and then and then an angel was sent to you, and then the angel was sent to that particular body, and then it is, and the spirit or soul is placed into it, blown into it. And then the angel is commissioned with four things, or four things are attached to that soul, because bi rizqihi wa ajalihi wa amalihi right? And so the person's provision, lifespan, work, and whether or not he'll be happy or wretched, or happy or sad, is determined at that point. So this idea of human flourishing, and so the ulama say that this hadith means, when it says happy, the Asha'ira say it means for you to die upon Islam is for you to be happy. For the Maturidis, it's for you to live according to Islam. It's for you to be happy. And then we have up the modern period, we can call the postmodern period, which is, we can say, roughly around sort of like the 1960s and beyond, like to what we're sort of living in right now, with many often critics of the postmodern period, or some argue that it ended already prior to the contemporary times. So during the postmodern period, rather than what happened during the period of modernity, now we live in a time where there is no objective reality, right? So basically, reality, what is real, is determined on the basis of as a culturally specific, culturally subjective determination, and also, and in particular, it's determined by those who are in power, right? And so we'll find these threads that they run throughout. Feminism, we find it comes up in queer theory. We find it in things like critical race theory. These ideas about objective reality, or they're being subjective reality. Everything's all based upon power relations. That human beings are still outside of nature, according to this idea. And why is this important? Because we want to continue to say that sexuality, for instance, right, is not natural, right? There's no such thing as nature having something to do with your sexual preferences. That we don't have anything to say about, for instance, that that an individual can be a transgender person, right? Because if we say there is a human nature, a set human nature, a constant human nature, something biologically constant, right, then we can't make these arguments. Rather, almost everything becomes culturally specific, right, according to this postmodern perspective. Liberty is still the penultimate value to be secured by the state, and happiness or human flourishing is subjective as well. So these are things, and so fundamentally, the main thing that changes with the postmodern perspective, we would say, is that this idea that there's no objective reality, and what we could call sort of moral relativism, as we come to what we call the four pillars of postmodernism. And this is what we're threatened with right now, brothers and sisters, and this is an important introduction I think we have to have as we continue to talk, as we move forward and start talking about trying to save the Muslim family, to understand what we're really facing. What is it that threatens us, right? And so these four pillars of the postmodernism, according to some, is one, the social construction of the self, first and foremost, right? The idea that, for instance, race is a social construct to begin with, right? So my blackness, or your whiteness, or your Arabness, or whatever, et cetera, is all a social construct, right? And there is some truth to this idea about race and being a social construct. However, there is something biological about race as well, in that we do see people, right, even if they may not be members of the same tribe or the same nation, right, we do see similarities between certain people. Some people have the same skin color. Some people have the same exact hair texture. Some people have the same size and shape of their noses. Some people have similar or almost the same type of lips, right? So the idea that race has nothing to do with biology is baseless itself. Race has to have something to do with biology, but the ideas that are associated with race, totally socially constructed, right? So they will go further. Okay, well, not only race is socially constructed, gender is socially constructed as well. They make the distinction between what we call between sex and gender, which was something that actually occurred in the 60s and beyond, or towards the end of the 60s, moving to the 70s, where people start to make this very fine distinction between words like gender and sex, whereas prior to that, they were generally used interchangeably, even though we could say that gender was perhaps largely much utilized to distinguish certain terms in language rather than with respect to the human being, right? So for instance, you can have a, gendered noun or a neutered noun, one can be masculine, like the word king is a masculine noun, queen is a feminine noun, and then it or he or she, it can be, for instance, called neutered, meaning it is genderless type of noun, right? So, but the idea, okay, that gender is totally socially constructed such that women do not have any biological distinction between men and vice versa, totally baseless. And we know anyone who studies any amount of biology knows that there are physical differences between men and women, developmental differences between men and women, physiological, psychological differences even between men and women, right? Neurological differences between men and women. But again, there's an insistence to say that gender is totally socially constructed. So as long as it's socially constructed, then it becomes much more malleable. We can change it and alter it at will. So we fight against what we call the binary, the male and the female, right? There can be multiple genders. There can be scores of genders, right? Tens of genders, right? And you better not misgender me, right? Meaning that you better not refer to me according with a pronoun that I don't want to be referred to as, right? Even though you're just talking about me, not to me, that you are obligated when you're talking about me to call me she if I'm a male and that's what I prefer, right? And so, which is totally ridiculous, but this is the sort of world that we're living in right now, and it's been imposed upon us, being imposed upon our children as well. So it happens in race, it happens in gender, it happens in other areas as well. Another of the pillars is we call moral relativism, and fundamentally, which is to say that there is no universal morality, that is socially constructed, is based upon culture. Some things are good in certain cultures and they're bad in other cultures and vice versa. No culture is superior to another. And of course, we would object to this. We would say that, of course, there are clearly some things which are objectively wrong and certain things that objectively they're good. Such as, of course, helping the poor, right, is objectively a good act, right? Or murder is objectively a bad and evil act, right? So, but the insistence on moral relativism is something that we have to be very careful about. Thirdly, is what is called deconstruction of art and culture, and fundamentally. And there's some, and it's not to say there's not value to these pillars, but deconstruction of art and culture in the such a sense to say that no particular culture or the art of a particular culture or civilization can be promoted as objectively beautiful, right? Or representative of all of the norms and the sensibilities of all humanity, right? And of course, there are certain things which constitute art, which I do believe, and I do think that there has been experience done to show that certain people do acknowledge certain types of forms and shapes to be objectively beautiful, right? When they see them, regardless of, for instance, whose face those particular shapes are on, with whatever color the person may be, for instance. And then lastly, is what we call globalization. And it's this idea, just in short, the idea that the human being, that these ideas need to be exported around the world, and we need to form a world where no borders exist and everyone can freely to interact with one another, cross one border, in and out. And it's connected also, of course, with the economic. We already have a globalized economic order to an extent, for a large extent. We have that already, but removing borders, and even though still at this point, no country on the planet that I'm aware of actually believes in open borders, that whereas anybody can come in at will and leave at will and have no responsibility for anything that they do. So these are important ideas that influence what the way that we vote influence, a whole lot of other things as well, right? Right. And so then we have what some scholars call the two principles of postmodernism. One is what is called a knowledge principle, the other a political principle. The knowledge principle is radical skepticism about objective reality and a commitment to cultural constructivism. And then the political principle is that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how. Now, the second principle, of course, is also important. We've talked a lot about the first principle, but the second principle about we call the systems of power and hierarchies, and that being considered a problem, is one of the main things that tears down or destroys families. Because when you work on the assumption that, for instance, they say patriarchy is evil. Patriarchy is evil. That is to say that men being in charge exclusively or being the majority of those in charge is itself a problem, which needs to be deconstructed and dismantled to the extent that we ensure that there's equal sharing between both genders. For instance, they have 50-50, right? This panel, we talk about all male panels, we talk about all female panels, everybody's outraged about panels, personally, I'm not outraged by either a male panel or female panel. I think both of them are important. I believe personally that Islam encourages us to try to create much more of a meritocracy where people are invited to present who actually are qualified. It's based upon them being qualified. Heck, there are Sahaba who the Prophet ﷺ came to them directly and told them that never take an office of power, right? Told them, you don't have the qualifications to rule, right? The Prophet ﷺ even used to tell certain people, certain men this, right? But this idea that that's merely living in a hierarchical existence itself is oppressive, right? Is a problem for us, because once we accept the assumption that patriarchy is evil, what do we do when we come to Quran 434, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa, that men are the caretakers of women, right? Men are the caretakers of women. Right there from the very beginning, I already believe, I've imbibed, accepted this principle that fundamentally men being in charge is a bad thing. And then I open up the book that I profess to believe in, where God says men should be in charge, right, of women. Then what do you do with that? Either you have to conclude that the Quran is wrong, which is kufr, or you need to question your assumption, right? Because it can't be both. It can't be both that either, it can't be that the Quran is wrong, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wrong about this particular prescription, right, for society, right? Or he can't be wrong and you be wrong, or he be right and you right, both of you together. Either one of you have to be right and one of you have to be wrong. And we know it can't be you, right? But fundamentally, when you embrace feminism, for instance, and we're going to talk about this after we have the break, then this is one of the basic challenges that you're faced with, right? And so among the themes of what we call this postmodernism that we find ourselves battling against, right? And we should see ourselves as battling against this if we are committed Muslims, in my view. We have the problems with the blurring of boundaries, for instance. So for instance, there's an anti-binary movement. In other words, the idea that there are only two sexes is a problem for this particular movement, right? This idea that there are two genders is a problem for this movement. But the Quran, as Muslims, what we do, we come back to the Quran, right? We come back, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell us about these things? And we're all throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, that he made the two pairs. He made, if anything, the Quran reinforces the binary. And reinforces the binary throughout the Quran, right? Right? That he reinforces the binaries. And from everything he made into pairs, in order that you would reflect, in order that you remember, in order that you take a lesson from the Quran. So what do you do with that, right? So when people tell you that there are only there are more than two sexes, right? There are male and female, and then there's transsexual, or there's intersex, right? Right. And so for even when intersex for us is simply we call the hermaphrodite. And in our tradition, even though we found a way to include the hermaphrodite in society, right? At no time did the ulama ever say that the hermaphrodite represented a third sex. Rather, the ulama said that the hermaphrodite is an obscure gendered person. It is either male or female, right? But we just don't know exactly which one it properly belongs to, right? But they didn't say that, well, we'll just make up a third category of a person called hermaphrodite and then give them their own set of rules. Well, to an extent, they did give them some set of rules because of the obscurity of sex, not because of them embracing them as a third sex, right? Or the idea that there are no cultural norms that the two sexes should adhere to, right? Because no, we don't accept the idea that everything is just all about cultural construction, right? That the roles that the men and women play in society, right, are just all. This is all based upon cultural construction, right? And now of course there is some degree of that, that not every society or every tribe places demands on their women, for instance, to nurse their children or to be homemakers, to sort of to clean the homes, et cetera, et cetera. The fiqh itself, for the most part, does not place that burden of cooking and cleaning, things like that, upon, or washing and folding clothing upon the wife, right? The fiqh largely doesn't necessarily do that. But of course, there's urf, that has played a part in that. But there are certain things which are not just simply culture. We can simply brush them off as being culturally specific, and they can be therefore overlooked. So, for instance, the Prophet ﷺ, he cursed men who dressed in women's clothing and women who dressed in male clothing, right? And he cursed men who acted like women and women who acted like men. So there was an understanding, there is an understanding that certain aspects of even gender, if we think of it as in the same way that the postmodernists think of it as which is sort of cultural roles and norms, as being connected with biology. So for instance, for modernists, they want to come and blur the boundaries, right? Blur the boundaries, that there's more than just this and that. The power of language, they believe in the power of language, in other words, that first and foremost, that language or language itself is about power, or language itself is determined by people in power. And secondly, that in order to fight oppression, that one needs to actually have control over language, right? And this is precisely why they're trying to compel speech. This is exactly why they want you to say that this man who thinks he's a woman is a woman, and this woman who thinks she's a man is a man, right? To control, because they understand the power of language. It has a certain inherent power in it. So there's some truth to it, but the way that they're utilizing it is in a very tyrannical fashion, and we have to push back against this. And I constantly tell people that when especially when you're talking about your children in school, and your teachers or your principals of school, your administrators are telling them that they have an obligation, which they're saying now, and for instance, in California, they have an obligation to refer to other children in school according to the pronoun that they choose to identify with. You tell them, no, we do not, and we will not speak to them and refer to them according to the pronoun that they want to be referred to as, unless it itself coincides with their biological sex, right? So if it's a girl, then we're going to call she or her, right? If it's a boy, we call him him or he. That's what we're going to do. But if you want some compromise, the only compromise that we will give you is that if this particular boy decides to change his name to a girl's name, like, for instance, Barbara, for instance, and the girl decides to change her name to a boy's name, let's say like Derek, then sure, I will refer to that girl as Derek and that boy as Barbara, right? If that's what they want me to. But that's as far as compromise will go, right? Because people can change their name to whatever they want to, right? So sure, I'll call them by those names, So the power of language, they understand the power of it, and this is why they're trying to compel speech, right? And thirdly, cultural relativism, we talked about. No particular culture is more superior to another. And then the laws of the individual and the universal. And what this means is this, is that first and foremost, the way that they see it is that it is not permissible for you to assume that every single, let's say, Black person is the same. You should not make such assumptions, right? That every single Black person is the same. But you also, right, cannot deny the existence of the Black person, right? And it is, of course, for political purposes for them, is that, so because I'm a Black person, or I'm a queer person, or this or that, I'm a woman, yes, right? But my collective identity means more than my individuality, right? But you're expected to conform to a certain type of assumption, right? Or certain type of image that these individuals who want to control language and other things conform to. And this is for this very reason. If a Black person, for instance, comes out as a conservative, right, or a Trump supporter, or a Black person comes out who doesn't consider himself or herself to be a victim, right, of the system, or denies systemic racism, they'll say that, oh, this person is not really a Black person. Why? Because according to their vision, the way they see it is that a Black person is supposed to be like this, right? So it's like, okay, you're not allowed to be an individual, and it's like, once you're an individual, you're no longer part of the collective, right? Because according to their definition of the collective, you're supposed to think like this and act like that, right? Yeah. So it's a very self-contradictory type of thinking on the issue, and it's very difficult to fully understand and explain at times, and I will end here and pause here for a second, and with this final quote by Saul Alinsky, who is an American community activist, very highly influential on the left, who died in 1972. He's quoted having said, he who controls language controls the masses, right? So we talk about, of course, controlling history. We talked about controlling language. And what we still haven't talked about is controlling the imagery. And that's one of the things I want to talk about tomorrow, right? But after the break, we're going to break right now for 10 minutes, and then we'll return. And I want to speak a little bit about feminism, inshallah. So I hope that's okay to do.
Yes, inshallah, that's fine.
Okay, all right. Jazakumullah khair.
What you